Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. This is part 2 in the series on saturation devices. Now, right from the beginning, I'm making it very clear these are saturation devices, not distortion devices. This one's capable of getting there into distortion, but we're showing it here as a saturation device. Now, definition of a saturation device being something that when you put sound into it, it makes a little indefinable change. Normally something that we perceive as the better. Now, the mythical device that I'm choosing here as being the perfect saturation sound is the Neve mixing console, which was very popular through the 70s because it tended to bring this wonderful beauty. Here is an idea. Now, this is not Neve sound, it's just the concept. Nice, rich, deep sound. If we take just the master off, we lose a lot. Now if we turn all of our saturation points off, exactly the same music, exactly the same sound, but somehow it's a bit like, compared to what we did have. So let's put them all back together. Yay! We have added a little bit of level there, but outside of that, we've also added a really nice kind of throw toward the bottom end, and a sparkle on the top, which makes everything feel really shiny in a nice way. That is saturation, and that's saturation done nicely. Really important to understand that saturation is not distortion. Distortion, when we get it wrong, we start to make a real mess. Now, the device that we're looking at today is Voxengo's Tube Amp. This has been around for a long time. Let's look at Voxengo. They have been around for a long time. It's primarily one guy, Alexi, I think, and another fellow who does his GUI. So one of them does the DSP, the other does the way they look and function overall. They have a lot of products, most of which are in the processor side of things. So EQs, saturation drives, things for viewing what EQs are doing, that's really part of EQ, compression and the like. There's a little bit of delay and reverb, but they don't do much in the way of effects. It's all around processing. And to be honest, in many ways they're very good at it. Their DSP is generally pretty darn good. The other side of it, a little bit not so good, but this as a free device has a tremendous amount going for it once you understand how it works. In many ways it's not complex, but saturation is a hard thing to come to terms with until you can really feel, because you're not hearing so much as feeling the difference that it's adding. Here, I think it's pretty obvious, but took me a long time to be able to feel that myself. So that's where you get the device from Voxengo, and you're looking for Tube Amp, which is free. Oh, a warning. This is nothing against Voxengo per se, it's their marketing strategy. They give you the free thing and then they say, oh, you probably want to look at this thing. My advice is you don't want to look at that thing. I've never touched the tube warming plugin, so it's nothing to do with that, simply because if you don't understand how to get the most out of this Tube Amp, then you're going to probably understand even less how to use the fancy thing, which means you're more likely to overdo it and get into all the negative sides of saturation, which means that your mixes actually end up going downhill. And that, I hate seeing and hearing that. You know, just today I've gone through 3 or 4 mixes that people have like, oh, can you listen to this? And I'm just like, oh, it just feels blunted, undynamic, basically ruined. Even though on the surface the mixes don't seem like they're distorted, they're basically ruined. And the dynamics of the performance is lost through too much saturation, which has become the negative side of distortion. So just go cautiously there. It's the same for every manufacturer, but until you fully understand and can get the feel that you're looking for out of Tube Amp, please go carefully with buying fancier, we're going to sound better and do more for you, doohickeys. Let's look through this fine fella. We will pop this up with our friend the sine wave. If you want to understand more about this in detail, then go back to the last video, which spends more time, but we look here at our sine wave. Let's just drop that a little bit. We can see there's an overtone appearing there already. That, boys and girls, is the magic. Push this harder. Ignore that, that's just digital coping. We see that we've got quite a lot of harmonics being created here. Just because you can't see them at default doesn't mean they're not there. And it's very easy, as I say, to be like, which is a long way from here, which is a long way from there. So you can see those overtones there already. We don't need to push hard. There are two modes in here. There's mode 1, which is very soft. You have to push quite a long way before you can start to see, well, about -18 before you start to see that overtone. But it doesn't sound the same as mode 2. Mode 2 is more exciting. If we push mode 1, we see we only get these two overtones. For some reason, I don't love mode 1. It feels, by the time I get things happening, it feels like it is, as I say, kind of blunting things. It's the higher overtones that I think are the exciting ones. So if you feel like mode 1 is not doing it for you, don't feel bad. Mode 2 is far more exciting. Just be aware that that is distorted. If you're trying to be Jon Lord, brilliant, wind it up to here. Which brings me to the dry mix. People will overdrive and then go, oh, well, I'll just... And that's good. No, it's not. It's just distorted. It doesn't sound better, it sounds worse. So my advice very strongly is leave the dry mix alone. If you've got too much, you've got too much. Pull it back. Otherwise, you're not really saturating, you're just doing some kind of weird distortion thing. Go get another distortion unit. Same with the filter, leave the filter alone. That's used if we are just trying to be slash. That's for if you're trying to use this as a full-on guitar amplifier and what have you. I'm not going to get into whether this is any good for that or not. It's great for saturation, especially in mode 2 if you keep your levels real low, keep your filter out of the game, and you keep your wet dry out of the game as well. We end up with a really nice character, but because we can see these overtones happening so much, it's adding a lot of brightness into our signal. That's the fun. That's the splashy. There's a little bit of undertone being created, which adds a nice sense of into things, a little like adding a sub. That's all good. Now with the bias knob, largely you're going to want to leave that alone, but as you see, as we move the bias knob, it changes the balance of these overtones in various ways. General rule of thumb is that it sounds more distorted the harder we go. So you can see it adding a lot more in the low end. So if you're unsure, best to not mess with the bias either. So if you're wanting a relatively set and forget, just as though you had a Neve, you don't meddle with the drive on a Neve, you just plug it in, then using mode 2, everything set to default, you really can't seem to go wrong. That's nice. That's one of the reasons why I've put this forward, because it's you can't seem to go wrong with it. so long as you're not trying to be a clever cock. Same as with the soft tube saturation knob. As long as you're not trying to be clever, you put that to 0.7 or maybe 1, and you can't go wrong with it. Just set it and forget it. Really good device in that sense. We'll run through the goods and bads. It has a nice sound. So Voxengo's tube amp sounds nice. It does sound exciting, which can become a problem, but you have to learn that when you're saturating, not distorting, that exciting sound is enough on its own, because it's how it all comes together. As you heard me A, B, and separate, pull out of that mix, the mix started to become less. It's sort of like, oh, the wind stopped blowing through the curtains. As it comes back in, through all the extra parts, it really grows. You could hear it grow just with the reverb alone. You could hear the mix kind of grow. That's the good thing with it. So it sounds nice and it's exciting. It's free. That's great. It really is super well priced. You can't bitch on that. It is free. And it's good. It's as good as you want it to be. You'll notice that I'm always using it with no oversaturation. I will use them without oversampling, because if they don't sound good with oversampling off, as into 1 times, then they're probably no good. They should sound good even if there is a little bit of bounce back. The bads. It is very easy to transition to distortion in either of those modes. And once you start to get into distortion, unless you're looking for a driven sound specifically, you will start to blunt or mute or undynamicize your signal, and it will sound worse. You don't want to do this, and it's very easy to do on this. The blunting effect is very noticeable in mode 1, and it's different from the saturation knob, the soft tube device. The soft tube device doesn't give so much of a feeling of blunting as this is prone to. That's because this is designed to be a full tube that you can push guitars and what have you into, so go carefully. Sadly, the manual is poor, and that's not just the manual for the device itself, but for the overview of all the devices. It is far too assuming that you're some kind of technical technician, Terry. And you know what? I'm not stupid, but I don't understand what you're talking about. It doesn't feel like you're explaining anything to me. And if all your clients happen to be rocket scientists, fair enough. But even there, I think it's poor. I think they'd be going, well, but you're not explaining how the thing works. No, because you don't explain how it works. And this is a particular issue because with the free device, they are pushing themselves towards beginners. And if their manual doesn't help the beginner, then they're not serving either themselves, because you get confused and walk away, as I did with this device 20 or so years ago. That I remember getting this device and just going, it does nothing, and then it just sounds bloody horrible. The lack of being able to get a manual to explain to me what was going on and how to get the most of it just put me off. Now, I know some Charlie's going to go, oh, but you try the presets and you find the preset that's closest and then wiggle the knobs a little bit. No, you do not. This is not how mixing works. You can feel like you're being clever, but that's just like being random. It's not how you mix, because you're just... It's not the way it works, and it shouldn't be that way. Presets might be a way of saying, yeah, if you turn the knob here, then you're going to start to sound a little bit like Malmsteen. If you turn the knob a little bit further, you're going to sound like Megadeth. Fair enough, a preset can be useful in that way, but in terms of actually mixing with that kind of a mindset, you're really wrong. So the manual doesn't help you to understand the device, and the kind of ugly nature of their interfaces, while simple and universal, as in they all look the same as each other, that makes a kind of a sense. Like Melder, it's very hard to get your head around where the magic is, where their manuals and their interface doesn't help you to feel an art in their device, which is a shame. So if you're struggling with that, either move to find something that feels like, oh, I can connect to this as an artist, or do stuff like watching this, and hopefully this will help you to understand, that's what that's doing, because now I understand what this is doing and how to get there. Then I think it's actually really a lovely device, especially for its price. Right, moving into the more exciting section of the program now that we've gotten over all of that stuff. Somebody did say to me that they were left feeling somewhat unsure about the where do I put my saturation in my chain. Now, in the last video, I did very strongly advise, and I will very strongly advise again, you pick one of two main options as to where you put your saturation. There are two approaches. We've got our mythical Neve, we've got our synthesizer, we've got our really lovely effects unit, and we've got this Neve. This represents the Neve. This represents the jack on the back of the Neve where you jam the sound out of your synthesizer through its sound effect into the Neve console. That's the saturation point. So where do you put it? Well, one of two places, and only one of those two places. You can take your synthesizer, put it through its effect, take the sound out of the effect, plug it into your Neve. Saturation point. That's after the chain of effects between the sound itself and the beginning of the desk. Then you're saturating the total sound that's coming out of here. So in this case, it's subtractor plus Hertz delay, then saturated. That's one method. The other method looks more like this, and it depends on your particular DAW and how it goes, but most DAWs use a kind of a matrix. So you look at the mixing desk, and then there's rows and rows of little rectangles with names of plugins in them. If you're using one of those kinds of things, the Pro Tools Reaper kind of approach, then the first device is going to be subtractor, and then that's going to be your tube amp, which is the point at which, remember, we're jacking that into our Neve and the magic occurs. And then you will add your effects. So your effects will be carrying what the saturation has put in and carrying it forward. Either is okay. Choose the one you prefer better. I am far more of the approach of I put my saturation on the end of the chain, and I do that with each track or channel. If you mix and match, some you do this way, some you do that way, you might feel very clever, but then you may well end up with a mix where things don't gel very well because they're different. They're not part of the same thing. Part of the whole analog magic is this was the way you worked. And consistency of working practice makes it easier to get that beautiful feel from a mix. Up to you which way you go, but choose one and stick with it. If you try to be clever and outwit the system, you will probably outwit yourself and break your own mixes. I get so tired of hearing the broken mixes and so frustrated for that person that they're going, oh, but mixing is so hard. And it's like, yeah, because you're trying to be clever rather than trying to be musical or beautiful. Let's listen to our mix again, and we'll turn off all of the processing. Master's reverb gun. So that's our mix with nothing on it. Drums. I have put a little bit of reverb going into a little bit of phaser to keep these things moving. Nothing worse than drums that are just not moving because they're samples. Ugh. No amount of saturation will save that. Like if we go here, put this in, here there's no real difference because there's nothing for that saturator to work on. Whereas we pop these in, now we've got movement. We don't even know that there is a phaser there, really. It just kind of represents the movement that we get in a room, which this tube amp is really bringing out. It's got something to work with. Let's listen. Mode 1. hear how that's just become sort of distorted and just feels muddy. So rather than adding this sparkle, kind of like putting our sponge in champagne and going, ooh, exciting, this is like we've put our sponge in mud and gone, yeah. And this is the mistake that I'm continually warning you not to make. You don't hear anything happening, and so you go, oh, well, I need to push harder and harder and harder. And then it just sounds terrible. It sounds blunted, muddy, like all your dynamic has gone, your excitement has gone. Really, really bad cool. And even if we were to do this and go, oh, well, I'll mix 50%, all you've added is half a muddy signal. So don't go there. I will be honest and say I haven't found a point at which mode 1 excites me. I'm not going to say it's bad, I just don't find the excitement in it. So, mode 2, straight away we get this feel of just more movement. There's like a nice woof underneath without sounding muddy or anything. It makes our signal move really, really nicely. We can push this and think that we're doing good work. But if we balance our levels and then put it into the mix, which sounds nicer? Well, sadly, this does not sound nicer. So, we're not here to push into distortion, because all this is going to do is blunt our signal. Whichever way you go, even if you use the pretty one, it'll blunt your signal. So, we're going to leave this in its I'm not doing a lot mode, because it's doing an awful lot. Sounds great. Bass. Unusual situation, we've got a delay on it, we've got a flanger on it too. Again, just like the drums, we need to keep this bass sound moving and to have character. And what this does here is with those harmonics, it lifts our sound a little bit. And because it lifts it, it's a little easier to hear. And because of the way the human brain works, we hear those higher overtones and we then go, oh, the one below it must be louder. The one below that must be even louder. Adding a little bit of undertone, but it's the way that it adds those overtones which gives us the feeling of a richer sound, which it is, but also a bassier, smoother sort of a sound, because we're actually adding overtones. And that sounds nice. Again, we're not going to push this, because if we push this, on its own we can go, yeah, that sounds nice. And while it's loud, it's lost that lovely feeling of movement. It's lost its gloss. Here it just sits underneath the mix. There's like this boom, boom. There's sort of a subby kind of a feel without being homey. It's really, really a nice sound. I gotta say, I impressed myself. So there's our pair. In, out. In. Nicer. Electric piano. Mode 1. We do get some brightness as we push up like this, but it's not as nice as mode 2. But in mode 2, as we push, you notice it starts to distort, and of course as we use our bias, sounds more driven. Now that's okay if we're looking to drive this. You'll notice in the first one where I'd used the Voxengo on the electric piano, I said, you know, we got this sort of Boz Scaggs sound, and in that situation it sounded beautiful, but this mix actually wants to be incredibly transparent, incredibly clean in its feel. So allowing this to be more subtle. Yes, we're not pushing the pings and the tings as much as if we were doing this, but it's the subtlety of those as they just appear, as they just sparkle, that makes this work really well. So again, not doing anything different from the basics there. And our string. We can hear that our basic settings do still add body. They make this sound sort of seem to float a little bit more. That's good. But again, very easily it just starts to sound blunted. If we change our bias, it gets brighter. I'm hearing more sort of bottom of the air range there. But it also sounds hard. And if I want the string to be hard and forward in the mix, yeah, probably fine. It was like the muscly guy blowing the saxophone in Tina Turner's We Don't Need No Hero. That wants to be the front of the mix, so that kind of adding that little bit of hardness to it to pull it forward would be great. But it's wrong for this string. If we back our thing down, again, I'm not loving it. And it's not the fault of the device, it's the device is doing a great job. We just don't need that extra. So this sounds really nice. We'll let it have a little bit of change in the bias there. Let's see it in the mix. Yeah, I just don't want any extra stridency. There are times where I would be really wanting it, but I don't think that I really want it. So you see that everything here has got its saturation in it, not the reverb yet. And it's all been default settings. We pull them out, kind of goes flat. Now notice with the electric piano, when we put the electric piano in, the bass tends to sound better. That's your harmonies, that's it working together. Notice as we could make the string seem to sound better, but when we put it in the mix it sounded worse. The mix sounded worse. So how things come together will be changed by your saturation. Another reason not to work in solo. There's our bass back in, there's our drums in. Nice noticeable difference. Reverb. Pop this in. We've already got a lot of embiggenedness, so it's probably a little harder to seem to hear that. Let's pop this into just listening to the reverb. So this is just our return here. Off. On. Does the same sort of thing. Mode 1. Somehow again just gives me that sort of blunted feeling. Same again, just sort of a bit. But I don't mind pushing this a little bit of squish and a little bit of drive on reverb's not always such a bad thing. Sounds brittle and thin, a little bit distorty. I'm prepared to give that a whirl. Let's pop this back. It fills out, and at least in cans, I think that that's added a nice kind of character to the reverb. A lot of stock reverbs or free reverbs just haven't done that extra task. People then go, oh, but they sound flat and they're not very interesting, what have you. Easy. Just get something like this and put it before or after your reverb. and you'll find that your reverb suddenly becomes a lot bigger. Listen to this. If we take our mix, drop out all of these, here we go. That's no reverb. That's reverb without the saturation. That's with the saturation. The reverb itself has become bigger and moves nicer, including in the low end. So that's taken our reverb. Now the RV7000 is renowned for being a very good reverb, but also very, very clean. It can be clinical, which if that's what you're looking for, brilliant. But I like to have character at every point. We've now added character and that nice rich sort of jazz performance character that I'm trying to bring out in this piece. That's there. I think it's still reasonable to put a little bit of push and a little bit of bias on there just to sparkify it up. Once everything else comes back in, we've got a nice, warm, engaging mix that's got lots of feeling of movement. Even though you're not consciously aware of it, everything feels rich and shiny and glossy and deep. So now we come to our master. Out, in. Same thing, it just embiggens, and it really embiggens here because this is a second layer. We're taking our saturation embiggenedness and then we're doubling it, which in terms of drive, compression, any of these things is actually a kind of an exponential logarithmic something or other sort of math. Again, you don't need to tell me which it is. It's not a 1 + 1 = 2. It's a 1 + 1 = 47 kind of an affair. That's the compounding that happens here. So it takes those overtones and then does the same thing again. Let's look at mode 1. Again, I feel like this is just getting, as I push into that, so I'm not going any further with it. Mode 2, great. Okay, that's making the whole piece feel like, but the problem is the piece is also getting a little bit of distortion. We're losing that little, very delicate, natural pinging that we get out of our electric piano and our metalwork, those cymbals. Not so much the hi-hats, but the cymbals up top, they want to feel super clear and shiny here. And Drive takes that shiny off them. So we're going to leave this exactly as it was. Feels great. The other place that I might put this in a mix is after the compressor. Now, there's no right or wrong. Technically, it would be at the front because as the signals come out of all the instruments, the buses, and gone into the master, that's the point at which we're jacking in and doing the Neve thing. So that's technically how that happens. Different devices will behave differently. I commonly have the compressor first, so it levels off extra things, but there's no right or wrong. In some ways, I possibly prefer this on the front, maybe just because I've been listening to it on the front rather than after the compressor. But you'll get a different result. As expected, I feel like what this adds becomes less, that it feels more controlled when it's after the compressor. And some things you really want to control them before you start adding anything. This one seems to like to be left to run free, kind of thing. So I know it changes the order in which I have them, but it's sort of consistent. Work out which it's going to be better, whether it's before or after. The tube amp here seems to like the dynamic. If your dynamics are poor in what you're feeding it, yes, you could find that it very easily starts to get into distortion territory. That's blunting, making your mix seem less sparkly and foofy. Sorry, neighbours seem to be very crashy this afternoon. In which case, maybe your compressor, but I would say learn to manage your dynamics in your mix, which doesn't mean just putting compressors on everything. Although we will have a little bit of dynamic, very, very sparky, transient control with these tube amps as well. That's a part of how we're getting that woo with the transients. So that's our whole mix now with tube amps, and basically pretty well all at default settings. So I'm really wanting to show you there that you don't need to do much more than just drop this fella in and get the advantage of what it is. Exactly, if you had a Neve, just by plugging everything into the Neve and mixing nicely, you will get that advantage. So no getting this and feeling that you have to get all producery about it, but wiggling the knobs to prove how clever you are. You're far cleverer to actually get this, put it in with these settings, these default settings, and let it do its magic, because it's not the one sound on its own where the magic comes. It's in as all these sounds are put together, and then very much as we bring in the reverb with its saturation and this master. We top these two off. Notice how alone our sound suddenly is so much less. Wonderful. So the Voxengo tube amp, it is a freebie from Voxengo. Its support is poor, which is a shame. It's not going to teach you how it works. But once you understand how it works, and remember, go back to the first video in this series where we're looking at how saturation really works, how it comes to be there, it'll make sense. Pop it in mode 2 with these default settings, and so long as your dynamics are good and your levels are good, like you're not running things all that as loud as they will go with your first sound, and then your second one as loud as it'll go, and then wondering why it's just, well, nasty. Run reasonable levels, and I'm not saying run around and gain stage like an idiot. Notice I do none of that. But bottom line, if I've got my mix completed and I drop in a tube amp, where in whichever position I decide that I'm going to drop it, I like to do it after the effects, because that way it rides the whole sound, including on my reverb, then suddenly we've got this really nice pro studio sound that, if anybody's listening to your stuff and going, it's just whatever. Unless they're pointing out a very specific mixing flaw, like the person whose mix I listened to, and they had, I guess, mastered it with a great big stereo widener, so there was a pair of holes in the middle, stuff splashed so far out here that the singer sounded like she was isolated. It was worse because you could hear the auto-tuning that we weren't supposed to hear, or Melodyne or whatever. You could hear the electronic tuning on her, and I don't know whether she needed it, but it sure weren't helping. I don't think there was any reverb, or if it was, the stereo widening it just mutilated it. And it was almost impossible to listen to because the stereo widener had created these two competing things on either side that my poor brain could not put together, so it actually gives you a sort of a vertigo. I called my partner to see what she would say, and she's like, I think the mix is distorted. She doesn't have the words or the understanding to say what's wrong, but she just hears it as distortion. Like the moment it comes in, she's like, that's nasty. You don't want to be doing that kind of stuff. And that's from somebody who, well, I hope they weren't trained, because they weren't trained. If that was the case, they shouldn't have gotten a degree, which is super a shame, because I feel for the band with the video, because it was really the video I was supposed to be looking at, and it's like, wow, nice video, nicely done, bootstrapping video, and the sound was just like so broken. But somebody is thinking, oh, well, I'm so producery and I've done all this stuff, and oh. So don't go this way. This is one of those things you can drop in, and if you've got everything else in your mix right, you will just get this really nice, rich feeling that will show your music for what you've got. If you have any questions about the subject, I'm not going to be able to troubleshoot Voxengo. That's what Voxengo is for. But if you have any questions about the subject, then please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. That's important. You need to return value. You get all this stuff for free by watching, so please return the value to help YouTube know that we're doing something good, and ask your question. If it is about what's wrong with my mix, I cannot answer your question unless you have used OBS, kind of the way I have here, or something that's similar, to actually record your screen and the sound as it is. If I can't see it and I can't hear it properly, I cannot answer. Very, very important. I'm not here to answer your mixed questions, but with these sorts of things, yeah, it's probably a thing that will come up. But if you're wanting to understand, you've got a question, why isn't it this or why that, then ask away, and when I'm aware of the question, I'll come in and give an answer, which hopefully helps you see a little bit closer, because saturation is a complex subject. It really is, and it's so subtle that it's easy to either miss it or to just overdo it by turning that knob up and, as I say, blunt or splatter what you're really trying to achieve. Well, that's it for this program. The next one is going to be on another saturation device very similar to this. We'll use the same program exactly, and you can hear the differences, feel the differences between those two, and then one more, which will be our fourth for the whole program, with the Softube being the first of the lot. Don't forget higherhertz.com. Pop on there for two reasons. One, to see the different channel of information, and the other reason to get your sticky fingers on the Hertz Delay, which is a free delay device, which is a beautiful thing. If you have a Windows computer running a 64-bit system, then this could be your salvation. You have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.